Welcome to the first panel of our workshop, Dispossession and its Legacies, Comparisons, Intersections, and Connections. This morning's panel is entitled Displacement and Dispossession in the Late Ottoman Empire. It explores some of the waves of displacement and processes that gave rise to both the creation and seizure of property in the late Ottoman Empire. Together, the papers address key forces, including influxes of Muslim refugees into Ottoman domains, the connected dispossessions of the Hamidian massacres and the Armenian genocide, and shifting property regimes in the Ottoman Mashrig, as well as famine and dispossession in Central and Eastern Anatolia. Our panelists include Nora Barakat, Assistant Professor of History at Stanford University, Ella Fratantuono, Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and myself, Matthew Ghazarian, Postdoctoral Research Fellow here at the University of Michigan. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Mehmet Polatel, has to sit this one out because he's fallen ill. I'm sure you will all join me in wishing him a speedy recovery. This panel will follow a workshop format, so that means that all of the papers have already been circulated to the participants, and we'll limit ourselves to short presentations to summarize the paper's contents for the benefit of audience members, and then we'll proceed to a discussion Q&A. Here to join our conversation is also Professor Robert Nichols, Associate Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota, and author of That Is Property, Dispossession and Critical Theory, as well as one of our workshop's keynote speakers. Now, without further ado, let's jump into these talks. First up, we have Nora Barakat presenting her paper entitled Building an Ottoman National Economy, Land, Religious Identity, and Capital Expansion in the Syrian Interior, 1850 to 1915. Take it away, Nora.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Is that visible to everyone? Great. So good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you're zooming in from. I just want to start by thanking the organizers and especially Matthew for inviting me to this workshop. And I'll also start, and this is specifically in reference to the keynote presentations yesterday that I gained a lot from, just by saying that I'm a historian of the Arabic-speaking provinces of the late Ottoman Empire. And because of that, I'm in a community where the main reference point for dispossession is the post-Ottoman Palestinian Nakba. And I'm excited to be here today, particularly thinking with scholars who are working on Anatolia and the Armenian genocide as their main frame of reference for dispossession. And I want to suggest that we think about these spaces in the same time frame, especially when we're approaching questions of Ottoman agrarian policy in particular. So the paper that I submitted starts with this not very well-known migration of about 8,000 people from villages around Nablus in Palestine into the Syrian interior to this region that the records refer to as Ajloun in the late 1850s. And what you're looking at is a map of the villages from where that migration occurs. This happens after a period of violence among merchant capitalists who were also tax farmers in that region of Nablus. And the migration is a separate research project in itself, actually. Here I'm using it mainly as a reference point to think about the way Ottoman officials were portraying the Syrian interior in the late 1850s. So the records describe this, this region, the Syrian interior, as a wild place of danger, inhabited mainly by Bedouin. And rather than seeing this migration of cultivating peasants to this region from Palestine as an opportunity to develop it, the Ottoman authorities worked very hard to bring all of these peasants back to Palestine in order to maintain its prosperity and its flourishing, is the kind of language that they use. And I describe in the paper how this view of the Syrian interior changed in the succeeding decades, right? So some of those migrants who avoided this state-sanctioned return process probably ended up working on large farms that were being established during this period in the interior by merchant capitalists. And I include in that term these indigenous Bedouin elites. They were already founding these farms on the eastern side of the Jordan River in the 1850s. Other capitalists and also Ottoman authorities got more interested in that process in the 1860s. They sent in a military contingent and founded a district there in 1867 and 1869 that specifically disempowered indigenous Bedouin elites and rerouted agricultural surplus to the treasury, which was the basic, standard process of setting up Ottoman districts elsewhere as well. So that period of district making happened before the 1870s crisis that comes up in a number of our papers, in which the Ottoman Empire loses substantial territory and then declares bankruptcy. Those crises were very important for changing Ottoman official perceptions of territory and population. So in the early 1880s, two groups of refugees come to the Syrian interior, largely from the Russian Empire, as a direct result of that period of crisis and that loss of territory. The first are Jewish refugees who are fleeing pogroms in Russian territory, and the second are Muslim Circassians, some of whom had already been refugees in parts of the Balkans that were lost in the war. And I guess I want to say, I don't think historians usually think about these two groups in the same frame. And Ottoman officials also saw them quite differently, but they brought up similar issues around land use, around property rights, capital, and population. So with regard to Jewish refugees, there's this important precedent-setting moment when Lawrence Oliphant, who's a Christian Zionist, puts forward this proposal to the Ottoman government to found a self-governing Jewish colony east of the Jordan River in that region that I showed on the previous slide, the Syrian interior. And he wants to do this by dispossessing indigenous Bedouin inhabitants and turning them into wage laborers. And he's quite explicit about that plan. He presents this to the Ottoman government in 1880, and it sparks this very long-standing debate among Ottoman officials. The more well-known side of that debate is the eventual Ottoman rejection of Oliphant's proposal. They say that a self-governing Jewish colony would be a state within a state. It would become a foothold for foreign imperial intervention. The less known sort of side of that debate is this faction of Ottoman officials who actually want to accept Oliphant's proposal because they see it as bringing capital investment and an industrious population to a region that they had come to regard after the 1870s crises as underdeveloped but full of potential. So this moment kind of sets up this tension, I'm arguing, between capital expansion on the one hand and sovereignty on the other, especially in the realm of property relations and agrarian policy, and especially with regard to these provinces of Syria, Beirut, and Jerusalem. The other important result of that proposal and increasing Jewish migration to Palestine is this eventual ban a couple of years later on Jewish migration to Palestine. The Ottoman government says that Jews are welcome in the empire anywhere but Palestine. And there's also a ban on foreign Jews acquiring property anywhere in this region. So Circassian refugees, Muslim Circassian refugees, are actually seen in sort of the opposite way. They're seen as productive, loyal Muslim citizens, potential citizens, but without any potential to attract capital investment. So in the 1880s and 1890s, there's this widespread imperial effort that Ella also has written about, and I think we'll talk about today, to identify empty land on which to settle these refugees with land grants. And this is actually what motivates the process of land registration in the Syrian interior. So they've already set up a district, but there's this process of very specific land registration, but limited, that goes on in the 1880s and continues throughout the Hamidian period. So registration proceeds in the 1880s on lands that Bedouin had used and controlled. And Ottoman officials were explicit in their claim that Bedouin would be motivated by the fear of losing land to register holdings, to settle, and to start cultivating. So I'm arguing that it's in this moment of refugee influx that this tension between capital expansion and sovereignty gets set up in this region, and that it's a tension that really focuses on religious identity in particular. So I'm also arguing that the result of these debates, and especially as they unfold in the 1890s, is a new vision of public domain among Ottoman officials in this region, public domain as a commodified, scarce space. So in the 1890s, there's another protracted debate between another two factions, although they're very similar factions as the one in the previous decade, among Ottoman lawmakers about how to develop the interior. One faction wants to preserve the interior landscape in the public domain. I call this the protectionist faction. This is most of the landscape of this region because at this point, very little has been registered to individuals. They want to register this land to Muslim refugees, and that they think that if they auction it, if they let it enter an open land market, it will eventually be bought up by foreigners, and that those foreigners could include third parties who are tied to Zionist interests, right? So this is again in reference to the concerns that were brought up in the 1880s, but it actually ends up being a much wider story. So for this faction, it's essential to keep Muslim cultivators on the land, and those could include those Circassian refugees, as productive, loyal, subject citizens. And what I have in this slide is one of the lists that's compiled during this period of, quote, empty lands in the Syrian interior, and a partial mapping of the list on the right, so you can see the region that I'm talking about. And this list also includes ideas about the land's arability, its size, etc. So on the other side, so that's the protectionist faction. On the other side of this debate is Ministry of Finance officials, land administrators, who argue that the land won't produce revenue if it's left in the public domain, and that cultivators will eventually gain prescriptive right by expanding their farming. And so this is this new idea of scarcity and its specific attachment of value to land dependent on its arability. And they also, I mean, this market faction really sees the treasury as a competitive actor in a capitalist land market. However, it's the protectionists who eventually win out. They institute a ban not only on foreign Jewish land acquisition, but on any open auctioning of empty, unused land in these three provinces of Syria, Beirut, and Jerusalem. And it's important to note that this ban effectively keeps most of the Syrian interior off the land market throughout the Hamidian period. So there is limited registration to refugees, but there's not sort of an open registration or an open auction. It's difficult for capitalist interests of any religious identity or any religious affiliation to come in and buy up land during this period because of these sovereignty concerns. So the part of the paper I've developed the least, and actually still needs more research, is about the Hijaz Railway. But there's another wave of discussion and politicization of these issues in the 1900s around the construction of the Hijaz Railway through the Syrian interior along the pilgrimage route between Damascus and Mecca. And what this brings out is that some Istanbul-based lawmakers, especially those with strong ties to Syria, and I'm talking about people like Izzet Ulu Pasha, for people who are familiar with this group of politicians, they saw Syria and Hijaz as spaces of potential Ottoman redemption during this period, 1890s, 1900s, especially in the case that Anatolia was lost. And they also saw them as spaces of model Ottoman administration, in contrast to Anatolia, which they saw as extremely compromised by intervention. So this really increases the prerogative to make sure no foreign interests obtain land rights around the railroad. I want to emphasize here that for Ottoman officials, the issue is not Jews acquiring land, right? But it's any non-Muslims with potential ties to foreign interests. And there's this concerted effort to preserve this landscape as a loyal Muslim Ottoman space. So I want to just come back in the last few minutes I have and and sort of think theoretically through some of this, and also think about where it stands in relation to Anatolia. So I've been thinking a lot for a couple of years with Gary Field's stages of enclosure, right? This is First, the creation of a legal framework for private property, then the creation of physical markers of enclosure, and finally, the removal of an indigenous population and the reallocation of land. And again, in reference to the keynotes yesterday, I should emphasize that I really hear Robert Nichols' points about the importance of historicizing enclosure, and also how the comparative frame kind of illuminates the stakes of this discussion, but also the specificities, the historical specificities of these different cases. And I want to bring that back to this question of a comparison between the spaces I'm talking about and Anatolia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the Arabic-speaking provinces are sometimes portrayed as both pre-capitalist and as external to this emergent these emergent ethno-nationalist currents that we see happening in some of the other papers we're gonna hear today. I am, in a sense, trying to call both of these portrayals, oops, sorry, not yet, both of those portrayals into question, right? The portrayal, again, as of the Arabic-speaking provinces as pre-capitalist and as external to these ethno-nationalist currents. What I see happening here is the creation of the conditions for a property market and the simultaneous politicization of property relations. So it's important to say that refugee resettlement is extremely politicized in this region. Bedouin come together really for the first time to resist it, and they make counterclaims in court throughout this period. But this market creation is also very intertwined with questions of religious identity, as it was all over the empire. But there's also this explicit ban on capitalists obtaining land on an open market, and the reallocation of the land to refugees is also very limited. And this is, again, partly because of Bedouin claims and the violence that they entail. So there are Ottoman lawmakers that were, had these explicit dreams of resettling 50,000 refugees on this landscape, and they only ended up resettling about 5,000. Most of the interior region remained in the public domain. Functionally, it remained in the hands of Bedouin communities throughout the Ottoman period. So there's a framework also for private commodified property during this period. And there's also a framework for collateralizing that property and foreclosure. But numerous scholars have argued that foreclosure doesn't go very far, and that the separation between labor and land doesn't occur until the colonial period, i.e. after the Ottoman disintegration. So what all of this has meant is that physical enclosure, removal, and reallocation have really remained in the domain of the post-Ottoman Nakba for scholars who are working on this geography. I want to talk, I'm taking the prerogative that Matthew gave us because we're down one speaker to speak for a couple of extra minutes. I hope that's okay. I've kind of slowed myself down, but please give me a raised hand or something. I don't know if I can see the chat if I'm going on for too long. So Karl Polanyi's concept of a double movement has kind of been helpful for me in thinking through this. It seems to me that Ottoman lawmakers created the conditions for a liberal property market, land as an exclusively held commodity with value that can become a financial asset. But they limited that market in order to retain Ottoman sovereignty with a loyal imperial population of Muslim producers. And here is when I finally get to the concept of a national economy that I titled the paper with. This is a national economy in the sense of Frederick List, right? So List's idea of national economy was a bounded territory with a productive, integrated population inhabiting interlinked manufacturing and commodity producing hinterlands, right? So List came up with this idea in the American and German context, in contexts where he saw national integrity as being specifically threatened by British free trade policy. And there has been some research into the importance of List's thought to Hamidian era intellectuals. But here I'm more interested in the way that this concept and these debates actually affected policy. So it's important to note that, like List, these protectionist Ottoman lawmakers in Syria, whose arguments ended up winning out with these bans, were not actually anti-capitalist. Like List, they believed that getting to free trade and prosperity was the goal, but they wanted to do it in these careful sovereign steps. So I just want to end with a few questions about Syria and Anatolia in the Ottoman National Economy Project in comparative perspective. So the first one is, where was Southern and Eastern Anatolia in this national economy project, if this is something that rings true to anyone else? Why do we end up with so much more violence there in the same Ottoman order during the war, but also in the lead up to the war, as Mehmet's paper illustrated really well, though he's not able to be with us? Was there a similar double movement, i.e. a deliberate limiting of capital expansion in Anatolia? If not, can this partly explain, if there wasn't that kind of limiting, can this partly explain the different trajectories of these regions before and during World War I? Does the politicization of dispossession look different in different late Ottoman spaces? And then finally, just a counterfactual that I think about when I try to think about these geographies. What if the Ottoman legal limits on capitalist land acquisition, especially non-Muslim capitalist land acquisition, had not existed in the interior? And so, just to elaborate that for 1 second, if the bans on Jewish migration to Palestine and land acquisition, they're usually seen as a failure because many Jews did acquire land in Palestine, and there was substantial migration during this period. But what would that geography have looked like if those bans had not been in place, right? Or if this larger ban that I talked about today, that I don't think is very well known, against capitalist expansion in general, had not been there. Or if the Ottoman lawmakers had accepted Oliphant's proposal, as many of them wanted to do, or if they had accepted Herzl's proposals in the following decades. So I'll leave you with that question, and thanks for your indulgence and attention and reading. And back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Nora. I look forward to discussing those questions in the Q&A. However, before that, we have next up Fratantuono, who will present her paper, Failing Upward, Critique, Contestation, and State Consolidation Through Ottoman Immigrant Settlement. Ella.
Thank you, Matthew. I too am going to share my screen. And I guess I'll begin by saying it's tough to follow Nora. On the one hand, it's really wonderful to follow Nora because she sets things up so nicely. On the other, she's so brilliant that it's hard to measure up. And I'll also say good morning to everyone, and thank you to Matthew and Helen for inviting me, and thank you to the Center for hosting this wonderful workshop. As you can see from my title, I'm interested in failure, and particularly interested in how failure itself can be generative in state building. My larger research project engages with the emergence of migration and settlement regimes in Ottoman Rumelia and Anatolia across the second half of the 19th century. And the reason I'm interested in failure is something that Nora hinted at. I see this really intriguing relationship between grandiose plans for mass settlement and then on the part of Ottoman officials and others, a constant awareness and recording of failed plans, of human suffering, of contestation over land, and of critique over Ottoman officials and plans. And I think that discrepancy reveals some sort of unshakable premises among certain Hamidian era officials. The first of them being that migrant settlement was key to the economic development of Anatolia. And the second being that better plans and better follow through could fix any problem that emerged during large scale settlement. And while I wouldn't say that my thinking is really conclusive on this issue, I do think that this space between plan and reality gets to a larger tension that we as historians know Ottoman sovereignty was tenuous in key ways, externally and internally. We know that Ottoman governance relied on bargaining with some individuals, even those that were ostensibly a threat to this drive towards centralization. And yet we also know that these plans for change existed, and change did happen eventually in extraordinarily disruptive and violent ways. And so I think the way I want to resolve that tension is to recognize again failure as inherent to government rationality, and to read a little bit more into accounts of failure and seemingly weak authority, state authority, to see those as components of rather than detractions to a story of the reforming, modernizing Ottoman state. And so to do that, I'm going to sort of follow the same cycle elaborated by our officials, the cycle of first plan, then some discussion of failure, and then finally response or outcome. To do so, First, I'm going to talk about grandiose plans for economic development, and also comment on a relationship that Hamidian era officials saw between people and their environments. And first, we can follow the path of a particular Ottoman reformer, an individual, Ferik, or General Muzaffer Pasha, who himself is tied to really big pieces of Hamidian reform. He was a member of the Military Inspection Committee, and he was the chief inspector of the imperial stud farms. Both the inspection committee and the stud farms emerged in the wake of the kind of catastrophic military defeat of the 1877 to 1878 Russo-Ottoman War. And the stud farms, of course, were intended to create a modern, to basically serve the army and provide horses for a modern Ottoman cavalry. As chief inspector, Muzaffer Pasha was crucial in land discovery efforts. He's credited with discovering some like 900,000 dunams of land in Hudavendigar and in Ankara provinces. And also, I think it's important to think about how his role as chief inspector allows him to engage in some vast and sort of modular projects as he pings across Anatolia from Bursa to Malatya. For example, in the spring of 1891, I'll go back here for a second. He visits Sultan Suyu farm in Malatya, where he draws up plans for an irrigation project that would open up an estimated 150,000 dunams of land, or what he estimated to be 500,000 lira worth of territory. And in drawing up this plan, he noted that the farmers of West Anatolia had already harnessed the power of irrigation, whereas Malatya's peasants remained dependent on rivers to water their crops, and thus, quote, no one profited from the abundant land. So for the Pasha, proper land and water management could overcome the ignorance of Malatya's peasants and open up the area to development. Once Muzaffer's tour of Sultan Suyu was done, he traveled 500 miles west back to the area around Eski Shehir and the Çifteler stud farm to plan wide-scale development along the Anatolian Railroad. The Anatolian Railway Company received its concession in 1889, and by 1892, they had extended the railway from Haydar Pasha in Istanbul to Eski Shehir and Eski Shehir to Ankara. And by 1896, they extended the railway from Eski Shehir to Konya. And the railway itself became essential to transporting migrants east from the Balkans into central Anatolia. So in October of 1891, Muzaffer Pasha undertakes his 12-day trip to survey the land around the stud farm, where he finds enough land for 12,000 to 13,000 migrants. He again produces a map of intended areas for settlement, and similar to the register that Nora showed, a register of the same. That register noted the environmental characteristics of each area, as well as the group of migrants best suited based on environmental reasons to inhabit the spaces in question. And Muzaffer was not the only official to link ecology and environment to the project of migrant settlement. Soon after Muzaffer Pasha's evaluation, Ahmed, a commissioner from the Ankara Migrant Settlement Committee, toured the district of Sivrihisar, located in the near box B here on this smaller map. From there, he reported on problems of air quality near the rail line. He noted that locals had dammed rivers for rice cultivation and other purposes, giving rise to wetlands and ultimately undermining the quality of the climate. Because the wetlands and the climatic issues were the result of poor stewardship, Ahmed confidently asserted that a little bit of oversight and minimal expense could improve the situation. And again, he tied the environmental quality to the quality and productivity of the population, where improving one would in turn improve the other. And his observations ranged from merely optimistic to hyperbolic, as he boldly suggested millions of individuals could be settled within Ankara province with minimal expense and complete ease. So, was Ottoman migrant settlement ever a story of complete ease? The very presence of officials suggests that it was not. 8 years after Commissioner Ahmed, another individual, Ferik Hasan Saidi Pasha, also a governor general, also a member of the Military Inspection Commission, evaluated the settlement in Sivrihisar of Bosnian Muslim migrants who had been arriving in Ankara province since the 1877 to 1878 war. Hassan Saidi Pasha drew up a map and again offered up a register detailing incomplete housing for some 14,000 families in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 7,000 people across 25 different neighborhoods. This map and register are equally, I think, a record of failure and an assurance that better plans would fix it all. And if anything, more plans, including even blueprints to solve the problem at the level of the household and standardize housing at the level of an individual family, would resolve the problem. In 1900, 2 years later, it did not look like all had been resolved according to Hassan Saidi Pasha's better plans, because the French vice consul in Ankara reported that the city housed at that time 3,000 Bosnian refugees, and officials anticipated 12,000 more arriving. The vice consul described general dread among the Muslim and Christian inhabitants of the city, who were, quote, determined to oppose further migrant settlement. And migrants could present their own opposition. Faced with 800 migrants due to arrive by train, the governor of Ankara attempted to divert them from the city to a nearby village. Upon learning of the governor's orders, the immigrants protested, refusing to exit the train wagons and demanding to be transported the rest of the way to the city. And then once Bosnians in the city heard of their fellow immigrants' plight, they marched 27 kilometers to the village to lend a helping hand, ultimately forcing the governor to yield and allow the Bosnian migrants to disembark in Ankara. So for officials, plans were not the problem. People were the problem. Officials armed with their belief in the power of sound management, yet facing the problems of migrant illness, death, delayed settlement, conflicts between migrants and non-migrant populations, lack of funds, a situation in which officials could comment that in most settlements, migrant settlement was neither successful nor complete. The question became who was at fault when settlement went awry? And the answer was people, and the answer was, of course, or was frequently corrupt notables on the one hand and corrupt or incompetent officials on the other. And the response of this critique is to reinforce, I think, two essential trends in Ottoman state building. The first of those is the hegemony of the state's documentary regime, particularly deeds and land registration. So issuing deeds rendered migrant settlement legitimate, and it affected land transfer. Designating land for migrants became even more powerful as policies closed paths for landholders to legally dispute migrant settlement. As for example, in 1888, when the Council of State reduced the power of alternative claims by determining that once migrants had used designated land for farming or building for 2 years, they were immune to suits. And Ottomans themselves recognized increasingly the power of documentation, as in January of 1880, when a skirmish broke out among a group of Circassian refugees who had been stuck in temporary settlement locations for 2 years and several Greek villages in Sivas. The Circassians had just received permanent allocations and begun constructing their houses when inhabitants of 2 nearby Greek villages, who had suffered repeatedly at the hands of supposedly Circassian bandits in previous years, accused the migrants of building on already cultivated land belonging to the village. And the villagers said they were so frightened that they vowed to emigrate if the Circassians were settled near to them. When British Consul William Wilson visited the district, he found sufficient wasteland for 500 families, and he noted that the Greek villagers had hastily burned, cleared, and sown the fields they claimed to have cultivated, and they presented him with clearly doctored deeds to the land. Thus, I think the villagers clearly recognized how to try to make compelling claims to land via this documentary effort, and again, the idea that they were working the land. Second, I think it's key to keep in mind how this cycle of plan and failure reinforced another trend, the actual disciplining of officials. Descriptions and drawings of ideal villages certainly did the work of organizing space. And you can read this in a sort of James Scott sense that situating migrants within gridded knowledge was a way to render them legible or visible, and therefore their behavior manipulatable. Again, pulling upon a relationship between the environment and space and the people within it. So I think that we can read that for migrants, but I think we should also keep in mind how regularity was making visible officials' actions. requiring them to adapt standardized modes of organization and communication. Ahmed printed and disseminated the settlement regulations and argued that if other officials simply followed those regulations, settlement would easily unfold. Another official in 1884 recommended immediately issuing deeds to newcomers, as well as removing any legal possibility under which notables or officials could disturb settled migrants. And regulations in 1897 made clear the relationship between plan, oversight, and outcome. The High Commission for Migration would collect, quote, required drawings and plans so that the village streets will be regular and the installed housing will be secure, suitable, cheap, and attractive, unquote. So again, gridded knowledge, I think, reinforced the fiction, if not necessarily the outcome of oversight for officials. A note on context and all the things that are not stated in this paper or in this presentation. It's really key, I think, to keep in mind that Commissioner Ahmed penned his report in mid-July of 1893 in the midst of the beginning of the Hamidian massacres. And in his report, the people who would benefit from migration almost exclusively refers to the Muslim population. Migrants would undermine a Christian monopoly in the area and really allow a Muslim population to benefit from the rail. Whereas Commissioner Ahmed could easily correct the ignorance of officials by disseminating instructions and regulations. And parts of the wider population could be corrected through environmental reform or tutelage, for example. Others, of course, were excluded from this potential for improvement. There are other ties here to the railroad, to larger stories of migrant settlement, and then to security and military reform. The fact that all the people I labeled here were part of the Ottoman military, I think is important. Anyway, I left them all underdeveloped to instead focus on this question of failure, about which I'll conclude now. Governmentality or government rationality depends on several processes. The emergence of what Foucault referred to as a way of thinking about the right disposition of things, and then the plans that are intended to bring reality into alignment with that ideal disposition. And this is an impossible task. It's impossible because of the complexity of all the people who interact with plans, but it's also an impossibility in that if perfection would emerge, it would cease the churning of this constant will to improve that is inherent to a government rationality. Thus, rather than external to processes of reform, failure is inherent to the project of governance. That's true widely, and it's true in an Ottoman context. The story of human suffering that accompanied settlement is important, and so too are accounts like Isa Blumi's or Vladimir Troyansky's that recognize the agency wielded by migrants and non-migrants, as well as the insight that migrants and non-migrants at the local level were also officials sometimes. However, I think it's insufficient to leave our analysis at the level of failure. The distance between plan and outcome contributed to the embrace of a certain mode of governance, to shared understandings of the correct relationship between people, land, and property. Diagnoses of failure generated grounds for more intervention. They solidified the sense that success was slightly out of reach, and they called forth the need for more detailed maps and well-trained administrators and fewer ignorant people. In that way, I think the rhetoric of failure contributes to this really large process, the positioning of the state and officials as its representatives as seemingly outside of and acting upon society, elevated by that sense of regularity, standardization, and the binding qualities of legal codes and documentary evidence. So really that sort of positioning of the state outside and the creation of a supposedly rational bureaucracy both stem, I think, from generative discourses of failure. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Ella. We will also have much to discuss in a Q&A. Fascinating presentation. So next up, I, Matthew Ghazarian, will present my paper entitled The Precarities of Plenty, Famine and Sovereign Debt in the Late Ottoman Empire. So let me cue up my presentation. Is everyone able to see that all right? Great. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss how a globalizing system of capital flows in the late 19th century affected agrarian life in the seemingly remote regions of Central and Eastern Anatolia, what some scholars have dubbed the Ottoman East. And I'm going to explore this in the context of two different famines in that region. The first, in 1887, laid bare how the Ottoman government's links to globalizing capital markets through its foreign debts could aggravate the effects of an ecological crisis, drought, by draining money and grain away from needy, famine-stricken regions. And then the second famine in 1892 will show how famine could also affect the spread and historical progress of a system of globalizing capital. And it did that by helping to spread new kinds of debt and property as needy cultivators were forced to take on new kinds of loans during drought and famine. And together, both of these cases show how a globalizing world of capital flows entangled these seemingly remote regions of inland Anatolia, and also how famine offered a view of spreading this globalizing world of financial flows. It provided a new vehicle for spreading these new financial relationships and also allowed them to reproduce themselves on different scales. So here we have a map of world steamship routes that had developed by the early 20th century. And maps like this one illustrate the explosion of physical interconnection that occurred at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. But the inland regions of Ottoman Anatolia, where I focus, had a slightly different history because this explosion of physical interconnection and associated commodity trade were somewhat slower and more attenuated. As you can see here, this is in 1914, a map of Ottoman railways. And you can see how there were railways more developed along the coasts of the Mediterranean, and these in turn supported a boom in export-oriented agriculture and associated industries. But in inland Anatolia, those connections were sparse. The black line in the middle there, that's actually just part of the text that says Anatolia. That's not a railway. The colors were less than perfect on historical maps, but you can see the railways are really along the coast. Now, these regions of inland Anatolia with these sparse connections were very much unlike the port cities of Izmir and Beirut, Alexandria, areas that were directly plugged into networks of global trade and networks of commodity flows. Inland Anatolia was a bit more remote. But I'm going to argue today that even in these seemingly disconnected regions, you can find evidence that they were enmeshed in a globalizing world of exchange, not through commodity trade as much as through their financial ties with Istanbul, and specifically the sovereign debts of Istanbul. So I'm going to look at this at moments of crisis like famine and drought because they really bring those connections into sharper relief. So I'm going to start with this 1887 famine, which occurred on the backdrop of increased European financial control in the Ottoman Empire. So in 1881, the Ottoman government had accepted an unprecedented amount of European financial control to resolve its sovereign debt default in exchange for a write-off of almost half of its sovereign debts. Istanbul accepted the formation of a European-controlled Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Here's a picture of the decree that formed this administration, a translation of it anyway. And Here's a picture of one of its alternating presidents early on, Vincent Caillard. In exchange for a write-off of almost half of its debt, the Ottomans accepted the control of 13 to up to 25% of its revenues to this commission, which was dominated by representatives of its European creditors. In addition to this Ottoman public debt administration arrangement, the Ottomans also were made to pay a war indemnity to Russia after their loss in the 1877-78 Russo-Ottoman War, which Ella just mentioned in her paper. Set at 35 million lira, it was set to be paid over the course of a century in yearly installments, a century. While all of that may sound pretty grim, the coming in of Europeans to control a chunk of their finances and a 100-year mortgage for the loss of a war, some Ottoman economic historians have tried to look at the bright side of these changes. Specifically, authors like Murat Birdal have pointed out that the debt administration also bolstered foreign investor confidence. It lowered Ottoman interest rates by half on average, nearly quadrupled foreign direct investment. So for the people who were bullish as part of what Nora Barakat described as the market faction, in some ways, this foreign financial control wasn't that bad. But then, as now, I would argue that the seeming plenty of rosy macroeconomic indicators is a very effective tool for obfuscating what was actually an intensifying precarity for most people. And during the famine of 1887, I'll show how Istanbul's continued borrowing, at times against harvests, aggravated suffering by draining money and grain out of famine-stricken regions. So in 1887, I'm zooming in here. Here's a map of the Ottoman provinces. This is from 1907, but in 1887, we have reports of famine coming from Erzurum and Diyarbakir, as well as Ankara, Konya, and Adana. And correspondence from the time suggested that it was more increasing poverty than a lack of food that was creating problems for people. And a note by the British Council in Erzurum at this time underscores this. He writes, "The distress is not so much the dearth of grain, for last year's harvest, though not first class, was still not very much below the average, as the fact that the agricultural classes have no money wherewith to buy it." So this observation suggests that the issue here was a shift in the terms of exchange rather than an absolute lack of food, what Amartya Sen would call a failure of exchange entitlements. The Ottoman Famine Relief Commission correspondence from this time also demonstrates this point. So in Kırşehir, in Ankara, the government likewise focused not on procuring grain from afar, but by finding money to coax grain out of nearby granaries. So here we have some correspondence from the Famine Commission organized by the government during this period, and they found grain right there in Ankara province, in the imperial granaries, as well as those controlled by local tax collectors. So here's a description of the famine relief, and they find from neighboring Yozgat, from imperial stores and those of tax farmers. And just to give you an example of what this, or a visual of what this looks like, here, let's zoom into Ankara. That's Ankara from afar. We zoom in. Here are Ankara's sub-districts. Here's Kırşehir, and there's Yozgat, literally next door. This example shows how, with a bit of money, local grain could be coaxed out of local granaries and into hungry bellies. But money was in short supply. And there are many reasons for this during this post-1881 era, but one reason that I think often goes unmentioned is the hand of foreign debt. which was removing money and grain from Anatolia in the midst of this 1887 famine. For example, in 1887, when droughts and rising food prices were becoming more urgent in Ankara, officials there messaged officials in Kastamonu, neighboring the region, and asked them for help because they had reports that Kastamonu had actually had a great harvest and had plenty of grain to help out. But officials in Kastamonu responded that they could provide just a tiny fraction of Ankara's needs. And the reason for this was that the finance ministry had set aside Kastamonu's grain to pay part of the Ottoman foreign debt obligations of this period, specifically the annual installment on the Russian war indemnity. And so the ministry denied permission for major transfers of grain to Ankara and its famine-stricken people. We can see here, Kastamonu actually continued in 1888 to make diligent monthly payments to the Ottoman foreign debt obligation of the war indemnity. And we can also see that Konya and Adana, which I mentioned were actually in the heart of the famine zone, also began in this famine year of 1888 to make some contribution to the foreign debt obligation. Here, one of the early harvests, just as the famine was passing, was skimmed in order to be paying these Russian war indemnity payments. Now, at the time, British and American observers like these in the region, and rest assured there were many of such observers in the region, they blamed suffering from famine on Ottoman internal revenue collection, tax collection, which no doubt was chaotic and often violent, as work like Nadir Özbek has pointed out. And they focused on this, the oppression of tax collection, its fearful cruelty, trying to take money from people who were hungry, its mercilessness. In response, the British consul at Erzurum, pictured here, even proposed a solution to the Ottoman financial troubles, which was a tax holiday for people, which he called a cheap act of charity. Now, this focus on the supposed evils of Ottoman tax collection, I think, distracts and even obfuscates what I argue was just as cruel an act, which was to steal grain away from starving people to enforce timely interest payments. But these observers didn't see it that way because for them, foreign debt obligations were a realm utterly separate from regional famine or tax collection. These were internal and external financial relations that were to be considered in separate domains. But we today shouldn't buy into these historical figures' divisions of the world. And we shouldn't, I argue, because if we did, we would miss the ways that this 1887 famine underscores the entanglement of these seemingly remote regions in these global capital markets via Istanbul's debts, that the droughts that these regions suffered were exacerbated or even pushed into famine by the drainage of grain and money from these regions to support Istanbul's continued borrowing. I should add that just a few years later, Istanbul once again secured a foreign loan with future harvests, including some harvests from Ankara, which is, to my mind, a quite dark irony in a region that was just recovering from famine. So I'm going to move on to this next famine that I want to talk about today in 1892. And here I'm going to look at how this famine in some ways paved the way for the Ottoman government and specifically its newly founded agricultural bank in spreading new kinds of debt and property regimes among newly settled refugees, again, of the types that both Nora and Ella discussed in their papers. So in this post-1881 era, there was a special emphasis on avoiding extra burdens to the already burdened imperial budget. And so in this context, a lot of officials began looking for ways to substitute grants of aid during famine with loans as aid schemes. And during the 1892 famine, which was being reported in regions like Trabzon and Erzurum, the agricultural bank, pictured here, was a really important institution. It was founded just newly in 1892, just as famine was breaking out in these regions, and it became an important vehicle for these loans as aid schemes. So in famine-stricken Trabzon, here we have some correspondence from that region, the governor there proposed a lending scheme that he touted was able to end the, quote, need for the government to buy and distribute grain. Instead, people would be made to take loans out from the agricultural bank against their land. They would surrender the title deeds to their land as collateral, they would get these loans. And if they didn't have title deeds or didn't have any land, then local sponsors would be selected from the region to sponsor the loans on their behalf. This situation shows how loans as aid schemes opened a way to insert the bank and the government into local credit and land relations between cultivators and local notables. Now, in Erzurum, during this period, correspondence shows how the agricultural bank and its lending activities could bring out a specific result of these changes and of the famine, specifically land registration. So in this case, we have a letter here describing the plight of some recently resettled muhajirin, or resettled Muslim refugees. And in this letter, they talk about how they've paid taxes on their land for the last couple of years, they've been cultivating them, but they had apparently not paid the paperwork fees that were required for them to obtain title deeds. And so in this letter, they plead their case. We're suffering from famine, we need grain and seed, but we don't have title deeds. And the official correspondence is requesting, what should we do? And the response from the office of the Grand Vizier, who's pictured here, proposed an interesting solution, that there should be an additional paperwork loan, which could be added atop the requested loans for money and grain. So in addition to the amount requested, we'll offer a paperwork fee loan. And then they could send that loan as cash to the imperial land registrar. They would give them title deeds. People could immediately surrender those title deeds to the bank to get the money and grain that they needed to make it through the next harvest, hopefully. Here I see an example of how the spread of private property was unfolding in the region, in Anatolia. And it wasn't unfolding as a right, but as a deepening debt relation. The needy were forced to take on a loan, which would enable them to take on more loans, which would ultimately raise overlapping layers of threats of dispossession. And this is an example, I think, of what Robert Nichols calls in his work, the making and taking of property, creating property rights for the sole purpose of alienating those property rights, or at least threatening them with alienation. I also see a parallel to Timothy Mitchell's work on private property in Egypt, on large estates that were formed in part by dispossessing smallholding tenants. But Erzurum is quite different from Egypt in key ways. Egypt was a well-connected, export-oriented, at least the Nile Valley, well-connected, export-oriented region where huge estates produced commodities for export. Erzurum was the backwater of an imperial backwater, sitting on an all but disused caravan road. And yet, even in this disconnected, sparsely populated, subsistence-oriented region, a lack of grain and a lack of rain could open the door to the spread of a new institution, the agricultural bank, and new forms of debt and property holding, which in turn brought new threats of dispossession. So just to rehash, the 1887 famine, I think, gives us a window into how Istanbul's foreign debts could drain money and even grain out of famine-stricken regions, and that could intensify suffering from an ecological crisis. So we have a new world of globalizing capital, intensifying and changing the course of an ecological crisis in a seemingly remote rural region. At the same time, the 1892 famine shows how an ecological crisis could also affect the course of history for a new world of globalizing capital. And specifically, ecological crises could facilitate the spreads of new kinds of lending, new kinds of debt, new kinds of property holding into these seemingly remote regions. They could do this by forcing desperate people to take on new kinds of loans. So why look at this nexus of economy and ecology within inland Anatolia, within the Ottoman East? First, I think it alters our timeline and geography of the spread of this new stage of global capitalism. In some regions, like inland Anatolia, financial integration came a bit earlier than full integration into commodity trade and physical trade. It was going on, no doubt, but not nearly at the scales of the coastal boom towns and other areas that were more connected by modern infrastructure. So I think that looking to these regions shows us how financial integration could precede this physical integration and then bring about some similar effects that we see elsewhere. Second, I think it shows us a specific mechanism of that integration, sovereign debt, which reproduced debt relations on different scales. So on the inter-imperial scale, we have larger, more powerful European empires, which entangle the Ottomans within a web of foreign debt. But then what happens is on a lower scale, on the intra-imperial scale, the Ottoman Empire turns around and begins to entangle its own subjects within webs of debt obligations. So we see how sovereign debt can be a vehicle for moving this new world of globalizing capital through an interscalar movement. Together, I think that these examples motion toward a promising research agenda, which connects changes in agrarian life and ecological crisis to new kinds of capital flows between and within empires. Thank you. Now that we've finished up with our presentations, thank you both for wonderful presentations. We're moving on to our Q&A and discussion. I think that there are a number of shared themes here, including new forms of property, the resettlement of refugees, anxieties and attitudes about who gets settled where and to what end. So I think that there's a lot to talk about. I wanted to start with a couple questions for each of you to kind of throw them out there, give you a chance also if you want to ask some questions. And then I thought that we could each take some turns fielding those questions and then open it up to the audience for a Q&A if they have things they'd like to ask. Does that sound all right? Great. So I'm going to go through in turn, just in order of the program, with Nora first and then Ella, and throw out some questions that I think are interesting. First, Nora, I'm really glad that you ended with some of those questions on things that we could discuss, because some of them were exactly what I was thinking about, especially the comparisons between Anatolia, the Ottoman East, and Syria. One of them I wanted to start with was this question of where Southern and Eastern Anatolia fit within this national economy project, and why do we end up with violence there? So I think that some work that you cite, including Stepan Asturian and Janet Klein's work, sheds some light on what was going on there that was slightly different from the regions you describe. I think the biggest difference that came to mind as I was reading your paper was the formation of the Hamidiye tribal regiments. It seems like that was a big, both a concession of Ottoman sovereignty, insofar as the Ottomans sort of gave up on direct administration in some ways and said, you know, we're not even going to try to police the tribes, we're going to try to co-opt them. But then also, at the same time, an attempt to shore up its sovereignty in this attenuated way by working through local proxies. But I think the results, as both Mehmet Polatel's excellent dissertation and Janet Klein's chapter, especially on the agrarian question, really shed light on, is that you have this almost mafia-like organization operating in the region and affecting mass dispossession in specific localized sort of vendettas are getting settled here. Local tribal scores are getting squared, both both against local Christians who are especially vulnerable during this period, but across the board, you can see rival tribes being pushed off their pasturage, and you can see Alevis and Kurds and Muslims of all sorts also being dispossessed as well. In fact, that's a question I think that's been unresolved, is the extent to which this was a sectarian targeted situation and the extent to which it was across the board, but Armenian Christians especially having a really sophisticated set of institutions that they worked hard to build over the 19th century, thereby had a lot of institutions where they could voice their concerns, as well as a lot of sympathetic ears in the form of American and British consuls who were roving through the region. It's really tough, I don't know about for you both, but for me especially, to sort through that. To what extent do I have a really skewed archive? To what extent was it the real and visceral vulnerabilities of not being able to bear arms, or be conscripted, and being especially a target? Tough to square that circle. But that's something that came to mind for me anyway. The existence of this tribal regiment scheme that really changes the landscape quite literally. And I think that we could get into a discussion of the double movement there, but I'm going to leave it there and just throw that out there. The other question that you raised, I'm going to jump to it, that I thought was interesting is the question about the legal limits on capitalist-laden land acquisition. So this like outside acquisition. Something that came to mind for me was David Gutman's work on migration, Armenian migration. So especially after the 1890s Armenian massacres, but even before it, you have waves of Armenians leaving to mill towns like Worcester, Massachusetts, Boston, upstate New York. You have Armenians especially finding their way out with these smuggling networks, getting to these regions, making money in dollars or sterling or whatever, and then bringing it back and buying up. I believe his work focuses on the region around Harput. And this heightens a lot of anxieties, many of which you describe, these protectionist anxieties. And so I think there's a local story there, at least, or a regional story. And I think that we can find examples of that elsewhere. So I don't know the extent to which it was being dictated by Istanbul and to what extent there were provincial governors kind of speaking out to Istanbul and trying to find local fixes to this issue. But I think there is a similar anxiety, especially after 1878, of questioning the loyalty of non-Muslims, sort of traumas of the war making their way into policies. So something I'd love to discuss. Ella, moving on. I really enjoyed this notion of failing upward. I was a little struck by the title at first. I was like, where's she going with this? But now I get that, this insight that you bring, that resettlement plans, we could read them and their many different, optimisms and failures as rather than a divergence from modern state building to an important component of it, a raison d'etre for being there and drawing up new plans and bringing in new expertise and so on, this kind of self-perpetuating system of failure, correction, more correction, and so on. I'd be curious to discuss more with you if you glean from your sources, whether there were specific ways of discussing failure. Like, was there an Ottoman term for this? Or was it something that was just completely avoided in their discussions? Did they have any special euphemisms for discussing the failures of their colleagues or of particular plans? I'd be really interested to discuss that. And I also thought it was interesting when you discussed how most of the land for resettlement was initially thought to be in Eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia, these areas that were thought of as being especially empty and vacant. And I think that's something that cuts across your papers especially, and I'd love to discuss more too, these notions of vacant lands, empty lands, and how the sources that you looked at, if you were seeing competing ideas of this, maybe petitions from people or actions from people attesting to the fact that no, this is not empty land, we're using this, as opposed to the sort of Ottoman governing apparatus classifying them as such for whatever plans they had. But also, Ella, the fact that a lot of the settlement ended up happening in Western Anatolia, at least that you discussed, in part because the railways were there. So if you could discuss a little bit more how that worked, I'd be really curious to hear. I have another question in my notes. This wasteland category we just talked about. Yeah, the ways that officials, like it's related to my first question, but I'm curious about it more. The ways that officials talk to each other. I mean, this is a very nitty-gritty question, but the ways that they either berated each other's work, this person's a failure or whatever. If you had any conflicts that came up or any pull and tugs that you saw structurally taking place, either between provincial administrators in Istanbul or between administrators and particular sects or groups, I'd love to hear more of that, actually from both of you, Nora and Ella. In any ways, just to get back to that question of to what extent you saw an ethno-religious component to these discussions of development and economy and land, the extent to which you saw that explicitly happening, and the extent to which you were also grappling with the possibility of archives that, amplified some voices and left some others unspoken. I'd really love to hear more about that. I'm going to leave it there for now because I think you also will both have questions and our audience will have questions. But we could start there. I don't know, Nora, if you have any things to say, both either responses or questions for us or anything, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, that was a lot. I do have questions for both of you, but I'm really grateful for your responses. And I think I wrote in the paper but didn't articulate in the presentation that I was looking for more literature on the Anatolian situation in particular, because I mean, I will say, I think, yes, the Hamidiyya regiments are a really important difference, and there is not really a parallel to that in the geography that I'm looking at. I'll also say, though, that, and this was one of my reactions to your paper, that even in the existing literature that I've read and that you mentioned just now, it's not entirely clear to me what's going on with property registration in these regions that you're talking about. And what, because I talked about, in more populated regions that are populated, I'll be trying to be precise, regions that are populated by people who the Ottomans classify as settled cultivators in sort of the Syrian lands writ large. There had been quite a bit of property registration by the time we get to the period that we're talking about, right? By the time we get to the Hamidian period, I think there's a big question that's still in some ways unanswered around how that property registration went down. Was the property registered in, and I'm talking about agricultural land in particular, was it registered in the with smallholders, which we have some examples of? Was it registered to tax farmers, right? Because the land code really gave both options. And what's not clear to me and what's going on in your story is, okay, there's this collateralization of land in the with the agricultural bank, but who kind of has the option to partake in that and who doesn't? And also, what's the foreclosure situation when there's a default, right? Because one of the big parallel questions in the literature on Syria has been, well, okay, there's a mechanism for foreclosure that's very clear in the laws, but it doesn't seem to actually occur that much. Like these actual transfers, actual dispossession. And I mean, I think this is somewhat important for you because of this question of where is this poverty coming from? I think it's really important that you're making the point that this is a monetized situation, right? This is about money, not grain. But where is, who's in control of the surplus, and how is the surplus being defined as a, as a commodity? Who get, how does taxation work? And all of that kind of depends on, at least theoretically, at least in the mind, according to codified law, on who has title by this point. And so that's that has been part of my confusion and even understanding what to bring it back to the question of the Hamidiyya regiments, what their role actually is, right? Is it in dispossession? Is it taking land away that people actually had title to? Is it supporting people who had previously been in tax farming positions, or in some cases, dispossessing them? I think that's what's still, even when I read, like Janet Klein's agrarian chapter, for example, that's what's not entirely clear to me. So, and I'm not sure that it matters, for my larger questions about where the violence is coming from. But yeah, I think it does sort of matter to this question about how capital expansion works in these regions. I feel like these questions could go on forever, but that I was trying to like fold in my question for you into that comment. I'll go to David Goodman's work. I'm really excited to think more about the way that this sort of protectionist impulse is also playing out, and that's very, very helpful. Is there sort of explicit, that's very important to what I'm trying to think about here. How explicit is this ethno-nationalist impulse? And then I have a couple of questions for Ella. And I'm not being schematic enough. And please come back to me if I'm leaving aside something important. But I think that I do think it's important to recognize that what I'm talking about here are either, there's a codified legal corpus that I'm interested in, but there are also provisional laws, right? And there is a provisional law, as in a decree, that is limiting Jewish settlement and Jewish land acquisition, right? That is specifically, targeting a particular religious community because of its perceived connections to foreign capital. And then there's also laws in regard to the Hijaz Railway, and this gets back to, the Hijaz situation is complex and is in some ways always exceptional and always imagined as a Muslim space, and that's why it's like becoming harder for me to sort out than I initially anticipated. But it's important, I think, and what actually causes conflicts on the ground in the region that I'm looking at is this idea that 10 kilometers around the Hijaz Railway, there should not be any non-Muslim land acquisition. And the problem is, by the time the Hijaz Railway actually comes about, and there's also a spur of the Hijaz Railway between Dara, I think, in southern Syria, and Haifa, where there is a ton of non-Muslim land acquisition that occurred previously, right? That's where conflicts start to come about. But this is also true in the geography I'm more familiar with around the town of Salt and Karak. There's a long-standing indigenous Christian population in those towns, many of whom have acquired land titles. And those titles then come under question because they're too close to the railroad, right? And so there is this pretty specific, I think that we sort of jump the question of Jewish immigration, of course, has been rehashed in the literature many, many times. But what I'm trying to do is bring them into a similar frame in order to say, okay, there really is this effort and this concern during this period to foster a Muslim subject citizenry, right, that is connected to this particular landscape that I think, the more I read the memoirs of some of these guys, is really connected to this idea of the potential space of Syrian Hijaz as the redemptive space, which is sort of ironic considering what actually happens after World War I, but that, for this particular group of officials who are quite distinct from like Nahda intellectuals, I should say, in Damascus, where there's been quite a bit more research, who have this, sort of, I think, not, their view. They do have, what Makdisi calls an ecumenical vision that is not ethno-nationalist, right? And so what I'm trying to say is there's a few things going on here that we need to pay attention to. I talked for too long. Ella, I'm so curious about the backstory, and I feel like that is probably going to happen in the book. But I like where these Ottoman management discourses that are so, beautifully articulated in the article you published on this and in this presentation are like where they begin temporally and perhaps also spatially, and where you see them coming from and what they are a result of, right? Like that's kind of the big thing that I also have a really hard time sorting out in my own research, right? But all of the stuff about generative failure is really, you know, familiar and helpful for me. And I think I just, yeah, have been, for me, there's definitely a shift in the discourse, which is what I tried to start the paper with, between pre-1870s and post. But it's a shift that I sometimes think I'm overplaying, to be honest. And so I'm curious about what you think about that. I'm gonna stop now.
Well, okay, these are comprehensive questions from both of you, so thank you. And I've enjoyed reading your paper so much and hearing this discussion already. Let me see if I can kind of answer more than one thing at once. So Nora, I too wonder like how much of a shift there is after 1877 to 1878, or really all of the 1870s. I do think the shift comes through in some intriguing ways. Like, for example, like this renewed interest in Anatolia as a development space, and suddenly, like alongside the emergence of the railroad, suddenly, whereas like right at 1877, 1878, officials wrote off like Diyarbakir as too far away to possibly place migrants from the Balkans. Soon after, there's an interest, and I think it's tied to the Treaty of Berlin and sort of the identification of these 6 vilayets that are in need of reform. There's a new belief that we should funnel migrants into that area. So it's both, it's the economy project and the national economy project. And I think you see it too in kind of a like in the 1880s and especially in the 1890s, at the same time that the Ottoman state is preventing outmigration of Armenians from Harput or return migration of Armenians who've gone to the United States, as in David Goodman's work, is a moment at which the Hamidian regime changes the name of the Migration Commission to the High Commission for Muslim Migrants specifically, and embedded in the language of creating that new iteration of a migration institution is the idea that we should specifically facilitate Muslim migration and prioritize it, right? So not only some suspicion about, as you're pointing out, not only a suspicion about certain groups and whether they can own land, but also an elevation from an ethno-national or at least a religious perspective about who is ideal. I'm interested in the ways that there are limits to that. It actually isn't nonstop, all the Muslims should come, but nevertheless, it's kind of there. And in terms of Matthew asked sort of how are they talking to each other? How are they identifying failure? I mean, I think the language is really clear in terms of, again, sort of calling each other corrupt and kind of identifying, again, just identifying problems and blaming it on other officials. So an interesting case suggesting that this stuff was also in play, these plans and this response to failure were in play even in the 1860s. Is an individual by the name of Musa Pasha, who was a Circassian. In 1868, he, along with a bunch of other Circassians, petitions the state on behalf of Circassians, I think in Erzurum, maybe Sivas, and sort of notes that they're all suffering because land officials haven't really done a good job and haven't done their due diligence in distributing land correctly. After 1877 to 1878, Musa Pasha then becomes sort of in charge of land distribution for migrants. He's then accused by the British consul of being really, again, corrupt and only working on behalf of his own cohort for his own ends. And yet at the same time, when an actual, I think when that particular conflict arose between Circassians and Greeks, The consul also noted that Musa Pasha had done it correctly, and yet it was an individual at the very local level who was supposed to carry out Musa Pasha's plans that sort of the breakdown happened. So it's happening at all kinds of, I guess it's happening upward and it's happening downward and it's happening from outside, this kind of identification of failure. Another example from sort of the 1860s is sort of interestingly, there was the head of migrant settlement in Rumelia began his work in 1860. He was very into plans, he's very into maps, etc. Midhat Pasha arrives in the new province of the Danube. They have kind of a falling out, and Nusret Pasha gets sent to Erzurum to work on migrant settlement there. And Midhat Pasha sort of notes, oh, the last guy who was here, you know, the guy I just had this big fight with, he didn't do a good job of record keeping. And in response, we've got to come up with a standardized register for everybody, for all officials to follow through. So there is like sort of a longer trajectory, and it's not just all of a sudden in 1870, they realize that plans are better and plans are the way forward for the empire. I don't identify a specific, I guess I don't identify a specific moment at which those ideas enter into kind of the vernacular of like Tanzimat officials, but it's there to some extent. I too am not sure that I'm handling this in a schematic way, because there were such wonderful questions that took me in a lot of different directions. I guess one more thing, Matthew, you mentioned like sort of this problem of being, you know, not being quite sure if you have a skewed archive or not. I think the idea of land availability is very interesting, because in 1890, we're following on the heels of a tremendous famine that created a lot of rural to urban migration among the peasantry. Ottoman Anatolia was kind of emptied out a little bit in the 18th century and didn't sort of repopulate until probably the 20th. And so, yeah, and so I think that it could be denser, and if Ottoman officials saw that, but what they were ultimately articulating is something that comes out in Nora's work a lot. It's not that there was nobody there, it's that they weren't using the land properly, and that they had a productivity-based mindset, and if the land wasn't sort of being used in such a way as an end towards agricultural and economic development, then it was empty. There's certainly, yeah, plenty of response from people saying, well, actually, it wasn't empty, or it wasn't empty in quite this way. Maybe I'll leave it there inelegantly, not really with a concluding statement, but again, with a thank you for these questions and these papers.
Sure. I wanted to respond a little bit to some of the things that you both mentioned. Nora, on the question of to whom was this land registered? And was it registered to tax farmers? Was it registered to individuals? It is unclear with what's been written already. Like there, you know, you can see, I think it's, you know, you take it back to Donald Quatert, and he has like he's gathered and compiled some data on the average size of a land holding and where, and to me, what's interesting is the kind of regional differences that you can see, or not even regional, like intra-regional differences. You know, in Bitlis, for example, on the western shores of Lake Van, you have large estates emerging, which I, mostly following Mehmet Polatel, read as the rise of really powerful local notables, some of whom seem to have religious charisma, like they are sheikhs of this Naqshbandi Halidi subgroup that have spread. Some of them have official appointments and they're officers. Oftentimes those two things overlap. But I personally haven't seen evidence for this. I just have seen, you know, mentions of, oh, the obnoxious sheikhs, they use religion as a weapon and they take our land, this sort of thing. And like, I want to see that documented in the, yeah, exactly. I want to see it laid out. And so far I haven't quite found that. I wish Mehmet Polatel were here, because he has done a lot more like sinking his teeth into the nitty-gritty of sources from this region, especially in Ottoman. He also has a really great knowledge of the different familial networks that were operating in this region and their overlapping the kind of ways that one family could contain some key ties to spreading Sufi tarikats, key ties to the Ottoman government, key ties to old families, and so on. But that's just where my mind went when you asked about that. For me, in the case that I was looking at in Trabzon, for example, with this idea of sponsors locally to sponsor people who couldn't register their lands, I was so interested in this. And I went digging a little bit more, like, give me more. Where's the agricultural bank? Show me some title deeds. In my time in Istanbul, I couldn't unearth much more. And so I was only left to speculate. And I was really, it was just speculation. Like, is it that there are locals that they want to saddle with these really terrible lending obligations where these locals are going to have to lend to these impoverished, famine-stricken peasants, and so maybe those notables are the target of some property transfer going on here? Or is it that there are some favored notables in the area and they would like to give them a bunch of famine-stricken peasants from whom they can eventually take their land? And again, I think it will require more research to go in and see to what extent were foreclosures actually taking place for that specific example. But I will say, what I remember, again, and this is from meeting Mehmet's work, is that with the Hamidiye, there was a very multiplicitous repertoire of dispossession. So there were just ways to kind of under the table intimidate people into selling for a song, basically, vast lands. And so you have specific tribes who are able to purchase lands in this way. There are some ways in which the tribes have pull with local officials, and so they're able to, on technicalities or missing documentation or allegedly missing documentation, confiscate lands or transfer them to state holding and then transfer them to themselves. I remember him citing examples of this in his dissertation. So there are different ways that this happens. And the two major sources that I can think of, unfortunately, are both in Armenian. Again, this question of the skewed archive, they're really meticulous in their documentation, but one is Kegan Dergarabidyan. He writes a book called Hogayin Hartze, which is the question of the land, is the name of the book. And in it, he lays out his sort of personal observations of what's been going on because he's present in this region during this time. It's an interesting, if limited in scope, source. The other source that I think perhaps may be more useful, but again in Armenian, but again cited extensively in Polatel's dissertation. I don't know if the Ataturk Institute has made that available already, if you need to reach out to him to look at it, but is the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul publishes a register of confiscated lands. But again, and they go through and kind of outline the different contexts of this. And this is for the Hamidian period. For the pre-Hamidian period, before 1878, this is also going on. And this is available in English. There's a report of provincial oppressions, which is the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, the Armenian National Assembly within that, the kind of autonomous millet constitutional governing system that comes about in the 1860s. It commissions two reports. Perhaps you're familiar with them. They're translated into English. So they're readily available. And if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves, the majority of them are about land usurpation. So there are already people complaining about this before the 1860s and 70s. And this is where Stepan Asturian and others draw on this to say, look, these complaints are already getting louder in the early 1870s. On the eve of the war, we have these reports come out, and they're predominantly rural Armenians who are saying our land is disappearing through this fraught land registration process that comes out after the code. In its slow rollout in the regions, you already have people saying this is a problem. Now, for me, the big question is it that you have many people who have been working their land, and it just so happens that a segment of 20 to 30% of those people in the Ottoman East, these Armenians, happen to have recourse to this newly founded constitutional mode of governance that is especially interested in their welfare, along with an army of Armenian American missionaries in the region who are also ready to hear Christian plights. Is it that that's going on? And so their voices are being amplified while the same thing, maybe exact same thing may be happening to their Kurdish and Turkish and other neighbors, but those voices just are less, local officials are less interested in hearing and passing on these things. I'm not sure. That's a research project that I'm interested in, but have not made the time and bandwidth to do. Or is it that, and I think it's also a very real thing, that in the time of the Tanzimat, when these differences between Muslim and non-Muslim become especially high with the expansion of a conscript army, for example, that's only Muslims, and with changes in legal regimes, with trying to roll out new laws, the provincial organizations, and angry responses to that from, again, tariqats that are spreading in this region, like the Naqshbandi Halidi, who are reacting angrily to the second Tanzimat decree and expanding their own power in the region. That also seems to me a plausible explanation for non-Muslims being more vulnerable and also targets of these changes. I don't know how to square that circle. It's something that I'm constantly grappling with in my work to try to sort through. She wants to know who's in control. Who's in control of the surplus? How's taxation going? We talked about that a little bit. And who has their title? Again, that's Polatel. Yeah. I'll leave it there. Let me see. Do we have any questions from our audience, or have we taken a deep dive? It seems like so far our audience is we have a question from our audience. Fatima Muge Göçek, please.
Well, thank you very much. These are amazing presentations. All three of them are wonderful. And I think the ambiguities that each of you sort of demonstrate in your work, I think points to what I was trying to do, and we will sort of, Jacob Gaponi and I will do more of in the future. What I'm seeing here is sort of a triangulation. So this is the larger theoretical picture. I think there's a lot of variation within the Ottoman Empire. I mean, with the nation state, we sort of have even sort of more clearly the settlement of what private property ought to be, what its boundaries are within the sort of Western legal system that eventually gets adopted. But I think what you're seeing here is a transition period. And I think that there is a sort of, on the one side, the issue of private property. What does it mean? What are its boundaries? Who determines it? How does the legal system sort of fit into this? How does the administration, management, land management sort of fit into this on the one side? On the other side, you have social actors. Who are the social actors involved in this particular case? I mean, and that varies, of course, depending on whether you're talking about Istanbul or Izmir or Syria. I mean, these all have different actors, as you've pointed out, depending on what's happening. Are there refugees, the non-Muslims, who owns the property, who doesn't? I mean, and how things work on the ground. And this is why I looked into memoirs, because it really does capture. I mean, if you look at my chapter 3 in Denial of Violence, there is this Pasha who sort of gives two, in the aftermath of the Hamidian massacres, he gives two lectures, one to the Kurds, telling them, you can't just take justice into your own hands, we will do so. And then to the Armenians saying, hey, we're all trying to be a part of this modern nation. And so sort of do your bit and, join us and, stay with it in spite of it all. So in a way, you see how these actors negotiate things differently. The third leg, I would say, is the context. And I think what's happening in the context in this particular time is this tension between the politics and the economy. I mean, how can you convert your political power into economic power? By getting private property. And it is mostly those who have political power, sheikhs, leaders, local notables, and of course, Muslims at the expense of non-Muslims, who are able to then get economic power. And this is, I think, when the sort of depropertization of Armenians, especially in Anatolia, starts, as they are put out, so that, it is, I think, I argue that what happens is that it is sort of the relationship between political and economic power translating one to the other is sort of brings out the issue of identity, so that being a Muslim makes the big difference there. I mean, in that transfer. And that is when I think you see the minorities, those who are not seen, as sort of specifying that Muslim majority, are starting to get marginalized more and more. And that, I think, in a way, I think you identify the origins of the unrest that's going to happen eventually. So I would argue, you can sort of look at this triangulation framework in different parts of the region. So I wondered what you think about that. Thank you.
Nora, Ella, any thoughts?
Yeah,
I
or go ahead, Nora.
Sure. I mean, I am really interested in this idea of a transitional mode of private property, and the reason that I'm partly interested in it, and I see Robert Nichols in the audience, and I was thinking about this a lot in his keynote yesterday, is that I didn't get to address the issue of land use in your comments, Matthew, but the land code is very specific, and this is what most of my other work has been about sort of laying out the basis for private property right in Ottoman codified law is a particular kind of cultivation, right? And this is an exclusive basis for property right. It's it is exclusionary, and it does exclude particular populations, and this is the basis for this idea of empty wasteland. What I think it's important to point out is that that idea has a long genealogy in Islamic law. It's a genealogy that was repressed for a very long time. And Martha Mundy's work has gone into this in most detail. But I mean, in my sort of larger work, I think a lot about comparisons with what's going on in the American West. And I don't see that particular Ottoman construction of property right in the mid 19th century as that different from what's going on in these contexts where people are thinking, with John Locke, for example. And I think it's important to think about that and think about why we see these Western property, North American and European property constructions as exceptional, and really ask about how exceptional they are. Because there has been quite a bit of work showing that, there's definitely, I mean, in the 19th century, all of these imperial entities are looking to each other. There's tons of appropriation and borrowing, however you want to talk about it. But that genealogy of private property is an exclusive, idea based on cultivation. It has very deep roots in the, the framework that the Ottomans are working with in Fifth. And so that's sort of one thing that I wanted to mention. I do, what parts of that come out are extremely political, have to do with global capitalism, et cetera. But I do wonder about the utility of exceptionalizing, of excluding Ottoman property conceptions from that frame of private property. Because it seems to me that there's many similarities and many overlaps. But anyway, that's one thing that your comment brought up for me. So thank you. I'll pass it to Ella.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nora, and thank you for that, the Fatima Göçek. It's the first time I'm meeting you. It's very exciting for me. I think pointing to this ultimately, like I too am struck by the word transition in your comments. And I think all of these things are moving at once. And what we're talking about, like I take this sort of state-centric perspective, but a moment of transition in sort of doing that work of becoming, again, a modern bureaucracy. I think you're very right too to point to variation within the empire that maybe we can treat as a three-part question of transition and the social actors at play, the way things are working on the ground, and the particular translation of, as you put it, political power into economic power. Like, yes, all these things really, I think, ring true as a framework that both captures a very large thing and has some fluidity on the ground. Nora's comment also, I think reminded me that in so much of my work, I too am interested in kind of thinking about immigration and immigration regimes, not as both how they unfold specifically in Ottoman context, but then of course as really analogous to some other processes also as we heard last night, kind of an alienation or removal of some people from the capacity to even enter into these exploitative relationships. That we sometimes treat the Ottoman Empire as exceptional in that regard, or sort of, I guess, treat like the limitation of Armenian migrants or Jewish migrants as sort of parts of this particularly tenuous Ottoman sovereignty. But again, I think there are really interesting comparisons. This is the very same period when we see the emergence of Chinese exclusion in the United States, and really, again, like sort of an importing of labor that has been sort of expelled from the social order elsewhere, but sort of increasingly restrictive ideas of who contributes to kind of state building and empire building in a particular way. So yeah, thank you for your comments. And then Nora, you also got me thinking about another element of this sort of comparative work that we can do to both recognize what's exceptional about the Ottoman Empire without overemphasizing what is sort of exceptional about the Ottoman Empire.
Intersections, connections, comparisons. It's what we're here for. Next up, thank you, both Fatma Gojek and Nora Barakat and Ella. Ronald Sunni, we yield the floor to you for a question.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice papers. I'm sorry I didn't have access to the papers, but I'll try to get them at some point. First of all, for Nora Barakat, you raised a really interesting question about this interior of Syria. And I remember years ago at one of our Watts workshops that Fuad Dündar found 2 documents from Talat Pasha. And one said that this area in Syria, and I'm not sure it's your area, because it's more, around Deir Zor and those places, but were uninhabitable. People would simply not survive there. And then a second document in which he showed that, in fact, they were going to send Armenians there. And we were thrilled by this. Oh, look, they knew what they were doing. But so was this a colonizing area? Was this a settler area? Or are we talking about different areas simply, and it's only a matter of geography? Second point I would make is I love these papers for what I heard from all 3 of you, but because you're talking about, in some ways, global capitalism, right? The spread and all those nexuses that Matt showed in his map of the shipping lanes. But it's clear that something else is going on, that there are all ways in which capitalism is inflected in different areas because of what's there, because of Ottoman property ideas, or we're going to favor Muslims to settle here rather than have open entrepreneurship or something like that. So I thought that the use of the word capitalisms might be really, really good. And the specificities that you're showing really undermine any idea that whatever the general logics of capitalism might be at some abstract level, that when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, things really change and they're different. And finally, this I guess is more about Ellen, your idea that you used about failure is amazing. That is, it's something really new for me, that it's not about people governing, but having the will to govern. and being in some ways always unable to. And I don't mean, President Biden or anything, but we see in our own life that things are happening that we wish weren't happening. And in my writing about the Armenian genocide, I tried to use an idea that in the Ottoman East, and I'd love to know what all of you think of this, there was sometimes not enough government and sometimes too much government. And once they got rid of the relatively effective Kurdish emirates in the 1840s or whatever, they just caused chaos rather than real centralization. And that continues almost to the end. So I wonder if that might not be another way of looking. So thank you so much for those papers.
Yeah, I actually have, if you don't mind me, Ella and Nora jumping in on that last one. It's something I think that's, at least in the Ottoman East, and I'd actually be really curious to hear about the different areas that you two look at, especially you, Nora, in the Mashriq or the Levant or whatever is in trend for calling it these days. The notion that there was a real rupture in the political regimes and how little we have on those political regimes beforehand. So these Kurdish emirates, I remember them being a real revelation for me that, oh, wow, it looked very different, up into the 1840s even. And, you have some sources, what I can think of are mostly foreigners who say they talked to locals, and the locals saying, it wasn't so bad under Bedirhan Bey. There was security, the roads worked, I wasn't being pillaged left and right and center. And there was kind of just clear structures of authority. And I was okay with that. Whereas now the authority is unclear. The members of the old order come and ask for their taxes, but then the new Ottoman tax collector comes and asks for taxes. And I pay both of them, and yet the roads are still unsafe and I'm being pillaged there. So, it's chaos. And I think that there's plenty of evidence supporting how this worked. I would love to see more on what did it look like before and what exactly, precipitated this descent into chaos. Was it, holdouts of the old regime? Was it new ideas about how economy should play out in this region, just failing miraculously, or at least not coping with the local conditions? Again, kind of dovetailing on what Ron just mentioned. But there is this big, there is definitely, the leading consensus that I see in the scholarship is a clear periodization from, it's the periodization I adopt in my own work. From the fall of these Kurdish emirates onward, there is a major rupture and a descent sort of into chaos. Nora, you mentioned in your work that Syria was supposed to be the model of good Ottoman governance. And so I'm curious, is it, you mentioned that in 1860, you have Damascus, and before that, you also have these other bouts of violence across this region in Mount Lebanon and elsewhere. Is it that the Ottomans stepped in early and they sort of failed early and failed fast, and so then afterwards they were just able to put the warring factions at ease and institute their own regimes, kind of using the violence as a way to step in and assert a lot of authority? Or I would just be curious of what the prevailing consensus is in the Mashriq.
Yeah, it's a really, I think that that periodization is prevalent as well. I think it is, the turning point happens, well, the turning point has to do with a couple of things. There's not that much research. There are a couple of, I think, exciting new dissertations about the early part of the 19th century. But I actually think this is, like you, I have a lot of confusion about it. There is a big turning point, or there's thought to be a big turning point with the Egyptian Mehmed Ali's administration of Syria, right? And then also 1860s, the kinds of transitions I'm talking about, where there's this sort of, in the interior region that I'm looking at, where there's this district making. And so, I, in my, post-dissertation book manuscript life, had to go and write a whole chapter about the 18th century because I was so confused about this, right? Like, how do these how do these like relationships actually shift? And I think for me, it is, you know, in my region, it's more about these Bedouin communities and their systems of authority. In other regions of the Mashriq, I think it's more about tax farming and, you know, sort of local power networks that are based on tax farming that's wrapped up in the Syrian case in the Pilgrimage Administration and become more complex from the 18th century onward, but more complex and more powerful. But I think it's a, you know, for me, it does have a lot to do with these shifts in global capitalism that you're talking about. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not only about, you know, these initiatives from Istanbul or from Damascus or from, I'm not sure where in your case, but it's also about local demands for such initiatives, right? From merchant capitalists, from, you know, in my case, these guys come into this interior region that I'm talking about, these Damascus administrators, partly because there's this conflict between these local Bedouin elites, some of whom are getting very rich with this new grain trade with the Palestine littoral, and some who are not, right? And so they actually call in the Ottoman authorities. And so, you know, I think that kind of expansion that you're describing also creates different kinds of claims and different kinds of desires for potentially a different kind of state, even though people don't necessarily understand what the implications of that are going to be in the long term. But yeah, I do think that, you know, 1860 is a big shift. And there's not, I think we need to come back to this idea of the long peace. And I'm thinking about Engin Akarlı's work on the sort of post-1860 violence period in Mount Lebanon, which is not really the region that I know archivally, but that we need to, you know, think harder about the way that different kinds of affiliations and different kinds of collectivities are being created that may look more similar to Anatolia than we thought. Even though they don't have the same kinds of outcomes, I'm really not sure that we can like divide it into two. Mount Lebanon does become a special administrative entity, but it's not really clear to me what that means, that means anything particularly different in terms of administration. I think that the idea of, you know, Syria as model administration in the minds of these Ottoman officials that I'm talking about has more to do with like what they perceive as less foreign intervention. Right, like they perceive that this is their space, especially like not Beirut, like the difference between Beirut and Damascus, right? Like Damascus and exactly on the other side of the mountains. Damascus and the region I'm talking about is a space of like, you know, sort of pure Ottoman administration, and that's you know, the space where they can show how beautifully their administrative processes work and how they don't cause all sorts of local conflict, right, and violence, even though often they do. And then there's all of this running around to make sure no news of it gets out and make sure everybody gets what they want, so that, you know, such and such French or British consul doesn't decide to come over the mountains, which of course was a big threat in 1860 itself. I wanted to say something to Ron about the question of Deir ez-Zor. I mean, I have to, the person who has written about this most extensively and most beautifully is Sam Dolby, and it's really, that's sort of the geography that he's most focused on. And I think he's also written about the perspective of the, you know, the sort of the desert where everybody was supposed to be deported to as an empty space. That it was, you know, that idea of the empty space was quite rhetorical, right? And I guess that does come out in my own work. I'm looking at the geography that's further south, but I think that these two spaces were played similar roles in the minds of you know, high-level Ottoman officials in Istanbul that were, I mean, Ella talked a lot more than I did about ecology, but that were very ecological, right? This idea of an uninhabitable space. I think we need to regard as discursive and as, you know, something that feeds into the way that property right is constructed through different kinds of land use, but also through different kinds of constructions of landscape, right? Like the idea that this is an uncultivable space, or it's not a space that will support human life, you know, is one that these officials are using, and also using in terms of how they think about deportation. But it's much more complicated, as Ella has articulated, when they actually try to make it happen. So I hope that, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I'm gonna, yeah, what did I miss, Matt? Or let's go, Matthew, or let's go to somebody else.
Oh, yeah, no, I think you've done great. I'm glad that you mentioned Sam Dolby's work on Desor, because I think, Ron, that would actually be exactly, the person to talk to. I do feel constrained to wrap things up just because of time. So as much as I'd love for this conversation to go on, because I feel like we're just sinking our teeth into some great details, I will say we should conclude here. And I do hope that this conversation continues, perhaps over emails or things. I'll send you both my notes and would be happy to talk with you more. And for everyone else, thank you so much for joining us in our first panel of the Dispossession and its Legacies workshop. And we really hope to see you after a half-hour break for lunch for our second panel. So thank you all, and hopefully see you soon.